that we might hear from you. Amen. Growing up as a kid in the 80s, living as I did in a state that did not have its own major league team, I had two choices for where my baseball allegiances would lie. For I had the Atlanta Braves every afternoon on TBS, or I had the Chicago Cubs every afternoon on WGN. It really was a toss-up there for several years as to which way I'd go because I really had no connection to either team. But one day, it just so happened that I was watching WGN and thus watching the Chicago Cubs. And on that day, I happened to watch the pitcher Rick Sutcliffe throw a three-hitter. And in baseball language, his stuff was magic that day. Curveballs breaking nearly 1.5 feet, fastballs painting the corners of the plate. And from that day on, I was hooked. And from that day on, right up until last season, I had reason to lament that decision ever since. For as I'm sure many of you know, the Cubs have been perennially horrible. Not only have they finished in the cellar virtually every year since my 1986 decision to become a fan, but they've also made time and again the most foolish front office moves in baseball history. And to rest my case, I need only say two words for those who are in the know. Greg Maddux. But oh, how beautiful last year was, because last year my Aunt Alex's beloved Cubbies, after 108 years of not winning a World Series, last year our Cubbies took home the hardware. And oh, the joy we felt as Cubs fans, for it was not only the joy of winning a World Series, which was euphoric enough in and of itself, but equally as important, it was the joy of knowing that we had virtually everyone coming back this year. And knowing what's more than even that, knowing we were young. We could ride this thing for at least 5 years. It's even what all the pundits were saying. So yes, it was a feverish time to be a Cubs fan last November. But then, spring began. And to say we've been a disappointment so far this season would be to understate the case. Every time it looks like we might finally be pulling it back together, we go and fall apart again. And now, with only 72 games left in the season, we're currently 5.5 games back in the National League Central, and we're getting nervous. Because it's reaching that point where we're beginning to face the reality that we just might not turn this thing back around. And that leads to the reason I bring up the Cubs and their current woes this morning. Because in our anxiety and in our frantic sense of urgency, we, as of Thursday, appear to be reverting back to our old front office tricks, to our old familiar move. Make a rash short-term trade at the expense of our long-term future in hopes that it might yield an immediate payoff now. Oh, we're legendary for this. Let me explain what I mean now. This Thursday, the Cubs, in their infinite wisdom, decided to trade 4 of our strongest young prospects, one of whom is the number 5 overall prospect in all of Major League Baseball. We decided to trade all of those prospects for one all-star pitcher who is already 28 and who, though he has thus far had an impressive career, started June of this year, so 2 months into this season, with a 5.22 earned run average. And while true, in the month of June, he has seemed back to his old self and has lowered his earned run average to an impressive 1.78. And while true, he could no doubt be a tremendous asset to the Cubs now in the short term. That's just the point. It's in the short term. It gambles the future of the franchise for the immediate gratification of winning today. And this is the same sort of short-sightedness that the Cubs have demonstrated since time immemorial. And while I promise I do have an actual reason for talking about the Cubs this morning, other than venting my own obvious frustration, I first want to talk about something else before I make that point. I first want to talk about a famous psychological study conducted some half-century ago by a Stanford University psychologist named Walter Mischel. It's a study famously known as the marshmallow test. It was simple. It worked like this. Mischel would bring a single child into the testing room, and he would put before this single child a treat, say a cookie or a pretzel or a marshmallow, hence, get it? The marshmallow test. And then, with the temptation there before the child, Mischel would then say he had to leave the room for a moment, and he'd tell the child that if he or she could wait for Mischel to return, he or she could then have 2 treats. But that if he or she wanted to have the single treat on the table, he or she could go ahead and have it, but then would not get another when Mischel returned. In other words, you can have 1 treat now, or you can wait and have 2 treats later. And then he'd leave the room for 15 minutes. That was the test. The test, of course, was a test designed to glean insight on the effects of willpower and patience and self-control in human beings. And so, over a period of time, the children whom Mischel tested were consistently monitored to see how well they were developing in school and then later in life. And the results were ultimately conclusive. The children who'd been able to wait for Mischel to return tended to have better life outcomes as measured by numerous different indicators. By SAT scores, by educational attainment, by body mass index, by future financial success, by indicators of overall happiness, by numerous other life measures. And thus there was proven to be a correlation between one's willingness to delay self-gratification and one's overall peace of mind and flourishing later. So that leads me to the most discussed book of spiritual psychotherapy of the 1980s. It was a book called The Road Less Traveled by faith-based psychiatrist M. Scott Peck. And the book, according to Peck, is a book about discovering and realizing the necessary conditions for becoming a fulfilled human being. And while there's plenty that we could say about this book, staying on the bestseller list for many, many weeks as it did, what I want to draw our attention to this morning is simply the way Peck begins the book. Because I think the way he begins the book is very telling. In a book dealing directly with steps necessary for realizing human fulfillment and flourishing, Peck begins by identifying one necessary discipline that one must regularly exercise: the ability to, as he puts it, delay gratification. In order to know a true sense of personal fulfillment, Peck claims, one must continually be able to exercise the discipline of delaying gratification, of practicing self-control. And nowhere is there a better story of the folly of impulsive, rash decision-making. Nowhere is there a better illustration of the wisdom inherent in taking the long view than in the Old Testament story of Jacob and his brother Esau. So let's look at this story together. But first, before we do, a brief word on birthrights in ancient Judaism. Because to understand the full scope of Esau's folly in this story, we must first understand what he so rashly gave away. In ancient Judaism, which is to say in the culture from which this story developed, the law stipulated that upon the father's death, the firstborn was to receive a double share of the father's property and was to become the head of the family, thereby enjoying all the tangible and intangible rights and perks that such a status entailed. In other words, if you lived in the ancient Near East, you wanted to be a firstborn son. Because if you were, your future was, in almost all ways, already provided for you. Such was the lot of Esau, for Esau was Isaac's firstborn son. Thus, unlike his younger brother Jacob, who would receive only a scant measure of his father's property and whose authority would carry virtually no weight in either his family or his community, unlike him, Esau was set to receive a great fortune and was set to wield considerable influence. So the future before Esau was bright, because his daddy Isaac had bank. He was set. Then one day he got hungry. Before going into that story, one more important thing to note. While, yes, Esau was set to receive these riches and this power, at this point in his life, though, he had none of that yet. For in that culture, respect and favor and adulation was not shown to the young. Instead, the firstborn son of families of means, in other words, young boys like Esau, had to wait for the day when, at their father's passing, they would finally ascend to this prominent status. That's why stories of deathbed blessings are of such importance in the Old Testament. So, the reality of land and fortune and influence was but a mere idea in Esau's mind as we read our story. It's not a present experience for him. It was just a future he could look forward to. Follow? And so now enter Jacob and his soup. One afternoon, so the story goes, as Esau comes in from a long, hot day of hunting, he finds his younger brother Jacob in the kitchen stirring a pot of soup he's just made. And Esau, smelling the delicious aroma of the soup, asked Jacob to ladle him a bowl. To which Jacob says, and surely the most disproportionate negotiation response ever, "Sure, I'll give you some soup, but first give me your birthright." To which Esau, in undoubtedly the most ridiculous counter-negotiation move ever, responds, "Okay." And thus Esau gets a bowl of soup, and Jacob gets Esau's birthright. All I can say is that must have been some mighty fine-smelling soup. Jacob must have been the Wolfgang Puck of the ancient Near East. But so goes the story. Now, in the history of short-sighted, impulsive, self-serving decisions, this one has to take the cake, or the soup, as it were. Even the Chicago Cubs could learn a thing or two about poor long-term planning and rash short-term decision-making from Esau. Because let's get this crystal clear. He was hungry, and in that moment he smelled a pot of delicious soup, and thus he traded a guaranteed future of land, money, influence, and respect for a bowl of that soup. So all these years later, we hear this story and we scratch our heads and we snicker and we say, "What a fool." At least I do. Let me tell you what happens as I do. I suddenly have a sickening realization, which is that I have no shortage of Esau in myself. And in the end, if we have eyes to see and ears to hear, that's what this story is really about. Not just about some long ago encounter between one impulsive brother and another, but instead about the pervasive human impulse to grab that which appears appealing to us in the moment, and in so doing sacrifice what will be most fulfilling for us and for others later. You follow? In other words, how many ways do we see the story of Jacob and Esau play out in our own lives every day? Though birthrights are a thing of the past, and though the story of Jacob and Esau is now some 3,500 years old, still, how many ways does the theme of this story continue to play out today? And not just in foolish front office baseball trades, and not just and young children who are crazy about marshmallows, but also in our own everyday experience. For how often do we spend money on unnecessary material comforts today, even though it's the expense of our knowing better financial well-being tomorrow? How often do we indulge our lust for unhealthy foods or for short-term pleasures today, even though it's at the expense of our own overall health and or our own most significant relationships tomorrow? How often do we sacrifice our integrity for tomorrow by not standing up to abject bigotry and systemic oppressions when we see them today? How often do we support politicians and public officials whose ideas and policies benefit us today, but do so at the expense of others unlike us and at the expense of our own common future tomorrow? How often do we trade not just our futures, but in fact our very souls for a pot of sweet-smelling soup today? For as Beauty and the Beast would have it, it's a tale as old as time and a song as old as rhyme. It's the human propensity to put our own immediate needs and desires first at the expense of our own and our neighbor's own needs, both today and tomorrow. And perhaps no one understood this human propensity more than did the Apostle Paul. In fact, the 8th chapter of his letter to the Romans is nothing less than a masterful elaboration on how God's Spirit is made most strikingly evident by reflecting on the long-term view over against the short-term desire. In Romans 8, Paul juxtaposes the flesh with the Spirit. And the flesh, Paul argues, is concerned only with the here and now, with the self and with its own immediate desires. But the Spirit, Paul claims, is concerned with both the now and tomorrow. The Spirit, meanwhile, Paul claims, is concerned with all people and not just the self. For the Spirit, Paul claims, is working for the long-term wholeness and the long-term fulfillment of both the individual and the neighbor over against the immediate gratification of simply the self and simply now. And then Paul writes, you as Christ followers are not to be in the flesh, but are to be in the Spirit. In other words, as followers of Christ, exercise self-control, he's saying. Think of the long term and not just the here and now. Think of your neighbor and not just yourself. Forego the marshmallow so you can have 2 of them later. Don't sacrifice 4 young prospects for tomorrow just so you can have an all-star with a 1.78 ERA today, and on and on and on. You get the point. So to close, let me first say this. I'm joking about the Cubs. The truth is, the Cubs have arguably the best general manager in baseball history right now. And meanwhile, I've never come above second to last in my fantasy baseball league. For all I know, this trade was brilliant. I have no idea what will come of that. I use it only as a humorous example to get to my point. But here's what I do know. I know that Walter Mischel was on to something with the marshmallow test. I know that we are most able to flourish as human beings, we and those around us, when we choose to exercise self-control and when we choose to delay gratification in the here and now. But I also know that we really didn't need Walter Mischel to tell us that, nor did we really need M. Scott Peck to elaborate on it in The Road Less Traveled. Instead, all we really needed was to read Genesis chapter 25 and to then interrogate while amid our laughter, we also began to feel a nagging sense of conviction as well. For the moral is that Esau's folly is often our own folly, and that Esau's tendency is our own human tendency. And so this day, and all days, let us remember that. And this day and all days, let us consider the wisdom of M. Scott Peck and of Walter Mischel. Let us learn from the lessons of the Chicago Cubs of the past and from those young children who loved marshmallows a bit too much. Let us consider what our own birthrights are, what gifts, what opportunities, what obligations, what responsibilities. Let us consider what our own birthrights are. And then let us consider what sweet-smelling soups appear in our own lives that tempt us and continue trying to tempt us into improvidently bartering those birthrights away. Or, in a word, let us remember what Esau did with his birthright. And then with profound gratitude for the birthright we have as Spirit-filled followers of Christ, as children created in the image of the Almighty God, as stewards of God's good creation and as caretakers of our brothers and our sisters, knowing that, let us remember what Esau did with his birthright, and let us learn from what we ought not do with ours. Amen.